Nora Hale arrived at the Crane Ranch with the late afternoon sun at her back, the light turning the dust, her boots kicked up into a haze of pale gold. The dust settled on everything, a fine grit that coated her worn skirt and the handle of the valise that held all she owned in the world, a change of clothes, a sewing kit fastidiously organized with threads of every color, and $2 silver, cool and heavy in her palm. 3 days. That was the time she had before the bank in San Antonio would take possession of the small rented room she had called home, and with it, the last vestiges of her former life. The ranch itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a final verdict. It was not a place of vibrant life, but one of stubborn endurance. The main house, a solid timber structure, sagged a little on its foundations, its porch listing to one side like a ship taking on water. A single board near the steps was split clean through, a waiting trap for an unwary foot. The corrals were sturdy enough, but the fences that stretched out toward the heat-shimmered horizon were a patchwork of new wood and sun-bleached, silvered rails held together by wire and hope. It was a place that had once been cared for, loved even, but grief had settled over it as thick and choking as the dust. She had heard about Eli Crane in town. A good man, they said, a solid man, but something in him had broken 2 years ago when his wife, Sarah, had succumbed to a fever. He had gone quiet, they said. He had gone hard. He worked from before sunup to after sundown, a relentless, silent force moving against the land, but the heart had gone out of the work. The ranch was surviving on the memory of what it had been. Nora tightened her grip on her valise and walked the final 100 yards to the house. There was no point in hesitation. Hesitation was a luxury, and she had exactly $2 worth of luxury left. He was at the water pump, his back to her. A big man, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his faded blue shirt. The shirt was worn thin at the elbows and had a tear along the seam of one shoulder, the white threads showing like a pale scar. He moved with a heavy economy of motion, pumping water into a trough for a pair of thirsty horses. He did not seem to have heard her approach, or if he had, he gave no sign. He was a self-contained island of a man, the silence around him a palpable thing. She stopped a respectful distance away and waited. The only sounds were the rhythmic squeak of the pump handle and the soft, satisfied sighs of the horses as they drank. Finally, he finished, and the silence rushed back in. He turned, and his eyes, a startlingly clear gray, took her in from head to toe. They were not unkind eyes, but they were shuttered. "Looking for someone," he stated. It was not a question. "I am," Nora said, her voice steady. "I'm looking for Mr. Eli Crane." "You found him." He wiped his hands on his trousers, a gesture that did nothing to remove the ingrained dirt and calluses. He waited. This was the moment. Her whole future, meager as it was, balanced on the next few words. "My name is Nora Hale. I was told you might have need of a mender. For clothes, harnesses, anything that requires a needle." He looked at her hands, then at her face. He was assessing her, not as a woman, but as a tool. He was measuring her for usefulness. She did not flinch from his gaze. She had learned long ago that looking away was a sign of weakness, and she could not afford to be weak. "I can cook and clean as well," she added, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm a hard worker. All I ask is room and board." Eli Crane looked past her, toward the failing fences and the porch that sagged with the weight of his own neglect. He looked at the tear in his own shirt sleeve. He saw a world of things that needed mending, a world of tasks that had piled up in the 2 years since Sarah's hands had gone still. He had let it all go, focusing only on the cattle, the one thing that paid, the one thing that demanded his entire strength and left him too tired at night to think. The house had become a place to sleep, not to live. He looked back at her. A slip of a woman, but there was a straightness to her spine that spoke of something solid within. You have references? I have my needle and thread, she said simply, and a willingness to prove my worth. A long silence stretched between them, filled with the hum of insects and the vast, empty sky. He was a man who did not waste words. He was considering the cost, the trouble, another person in his quiet, empty house, another presence in the space Sarah had left behind. But then his gaze fell again on the torn seam of his shirt, and a kind of weary practicality won out. There's a room at the back, he said, his voice flat. It's small. The roof leaks in a hard rain, but the bed is dry. He gestured toward the house with his chin. Supper is at 7. If you're as good as you say you are, you can stay. If not, you'll be on your way come morning. Thank you, Mr. Crane, Nora said, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She did not let it show. I won't disappoint you. He gave a short, non-committal nod and turned back to his horses, the conversation, for him, already over. She was a problem solved, or at least a problem deferred. Nora walked toward the house, her steps sure. She did not look back. As she reached the listing porch, her foot carefully avoided the broken board. She could feel his eyes on her back, watching. He was not a man who missed details. She had 3 days to save herself. Now she had until morning. It was a start. The room was exactly as he had described it, small, with a narrow bed, a simple washstand, and a single window that looked out onto a patch of stubborn, sun-scorched grass. But it was clean, or at least free of clutter. Dust lay thick on every surface, a fine gray powder that told the story of a house left to itself. She set down her valise, took out her sewing kit, and laid it on the bed. It was her altar, the tools of her salvation. Needles, pins, thimbles, and spools of thread in 100 shades, each one a promise. She spent the first hour not unpacking, but cleaning. She found a rag in a bucket, and with water from the pump, she scrubbed the dust from her small room. She washed the window until the light streamed in, clear and sharp. She beat the thin mattress until clouds of dust motes danced in the sunbeams. When she was done, the room was no longer just a space, but hers. That evening, she found the kitchen, another room suffering from a quiet, creeping neglect. She found flour, salt, dried beans, and a side of bacon. With practiced efficiency, she made a simple meal of biscuits and beans. When Eli Crane came in at 7, his face grim with exhaustion, the table was set, and a plate of hot food was waiting for him. He stopped in the doorway, the scent of fresh biscuits seeming to surprise him. He said nothing. He simply sat, ate every bite, and then stood, taking his plate to the wash basin. The mending basket is by the hearth, he said, his back to her. And then he was gone, disappearing into the part of the house she had not yet seen. Nora found the basket. It was overflowing. Shirts with missing buttons and torn seams, trousers worn through at the knees, heavy canvas work gloves with split fingers, and at the bottom, a tangle of harness leather, cracked and dry, with stitching that had rotted away. It was 2 years of a man's life falling apart, stitch by stitch. She took the basket back to her room, lit a small oil lamp, and began to work. She started with his shirts. The fabric was soft from countless washings. As she worked, her needle flying with a skill born of 1,000 hours of practice, she felt like she was learning the man himself. She learned the breadth of his shoulders from the strain on the seams, the way he favored his right arm from the wear on the cuff. Each repaired tear was a small act of restoration. She did not just mend the cloth, she reinforced it, making it stronger than it had been before. She worked late into the night. The only sound, the whisper of thread through fabric and the distant call of a lone coyote. When she finally slept, it was the deep, dreamless sleep of the truly exhausted. The next morning she was up before him. She set a stack of mended shirts, neatly folded, on the kitchen table next to a fresh pot of coffee. When he came in, he stopped and looked at the stack. He picked up the top shirt, the one with the torn shoulder seam. He ran a calloused thumb over her neat, tight stitches. His face was unreadable. He put the shirt down, poured himself a cup of coffee, and left without a word. Section. But he had taken the mended shirt with him. Nora allowed herself a small, private smile. She had survived the first night. The days settled into a rhythm. Nora would rise early, make coffee, and then set to her tasks. She cleaned the house from top to bottom. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, washed the curtains until they were no longer gray but a pale, forgotten yellow, and polished the soot from the glass of the lanterns. The house began to breathe again. Light and air moved through rooms that had been stagnant for years. Eli said nothing about the changes. He moved through the clean spaces as if he didn't notice, but she saw the way his eyes would linger on a polished tabletop, or the way he carefully wiped his boots before entering the kitchen now. He was a man who communicated through action, and his actions told her he had noticed. One afternoon, after she had finished the last of the clothes in the mending basket, she turned her attention to the porch. She found a saw and hammer in the barn, and a stack of seasoned lumber. She was not a carpenter, but she was practical. She pried up the broken board, measured a new one, and sawed it to fit. It took her the better part of an hour, her arms aching from the unfamiliar work, but when she was done, the new board was solid and secure under her feet. Eli came home at dusk and saw it immediately. He stopped at the foot of the steps, his gaze fixed on the fresh sawn wood. He put his foot on it, tested it with his full weight. It held firm. He looked over at her, where she sat on the porch swing, mending a piece of harness leather. His expression was one of deep, quiet confusion, as if he couldn't quite understand why she had done it. He did not thank her. He simply nodded, a short, sharp dip of his chin, and went inside. But the next day, a small sack of horehound candies, the kind she liked, appeared on the kitchen table. There was no note. None was needed. It was a conversation held without words. Her greatest discovery came a week into her stay. While cleaning the small, cluttered room that must have served as an office, she found a heavy wooden chest tucked under the desk. It was locked. The key was on a hook by the door, tarnished and forgotten. Inside, blanketed in a thick layer of dust, were 3 large leather-bound ledgers. She opened the first one. The handwriting was neat, elegant, a woman's hand. Sarah Crane. Every transaction for the ranch was meticulously recorded: the sale of cattle, the purchase of feed, the cost of a new buckle for a harness. It was the detailed history of a thriving, well-managed life. Nora could see the ebb and flow of the seasons in the entries, the hopes and plans captured in columns of black ink. She followed the entries through the first ledger and into the second. The handwriting remained the same, clear and confident. Then, halfway through the second book, it stopped. A single date was written at the top of a blank page: the 12th of October, 1883. After that, nothing. Nora closed her eyes. She could feel the weight of that empty page, the sudden, deafening silence after the last word was written. She imagined Eli Crane, lost in a grief so vast he could not bring himself to even open this book, to touch the last thing his wife's hands had touched. She turned to the third ledger. It was mostly empty. Here and there, a few entries were scrawled in a heavy, clumsy hand, Eli's. They were sporadic, incomplete. A price for a steer, a debt for seed. There was no order, no reconciliation. It was the bookkeeping of a man who had lost his way. Driven by an instinct she didn't fully understand, Nora took the ledgers to the kitchen table. She sharpened a pencil and began to work. It was a puzzle, a broken story she felt compelled to piece back together. For days, she worked, cross-referencing Eli's scattered notes with Sarah's meticulous records. She sorted through receipts and invoices she found stuffed in drawers. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to bring order to the chaos. She was not just reconciling accounts, she was mapping the landscape of his sorrow. And then she found it. It was a recurring entry in Eli's ledger, a payment to his neighbor, Harlan Moss. The notes were for a piece of pasture land Eli had bought from Moss 4 years ago, a critical parcel with a spring that watered his herd through the dry season. According to Sarah's ledger, the original agreement had a fixed, simple interest rate. But the payments Eli had been making, the ones noted in his rough hand, were higher. Moss had been adding a compounding interest, a detail buried in complex figures that a grieving, exhausted man would never have noticed. Nora's blood ran cold. She hunted through the chest until she found the original contract, signed by both men. She read it twice, her finger tracing the clear, unambiguous language. Simple interest. Harlan Moss, a man who shared a fence line with Eli, who had likely sat at this very table and shared coffee with Sarah, was quietly, deliberately stealing from him. He was setting Eli up for a fall, letting the debt swell until it became unpayable, at which point Moss could foreclose and take back the land and the water for a fraction of its worth. Anger, fierce and protective, rose in her. This was not just business. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind. It was a vulture picking at a wounded man. She knew she had to tell Eli, but the thought terrified her. It was an intrusion, a trespass into the heart of his affairs. She was the mender, the cook. She had no right. But as she looked at the evidence laid out before her, the elegant script of a dead woman, the desperate scrawl of her husband, the predatory numbers of a false friend, she knew she had no choice. She had been mending his shirts and his home. Now she had to try and mend this. She waited until that evening. He came in, tired as always, and sat at the table. She had made a beef stew, and the smell filled the kitchen with a warm, comforting aroma. She placed a bowl in front of him, but instead of leaving him to eat in peace, she sat down opposite him, the ledgers and the contract stacked neatly beside her. He looked at the books, then at her. A flicker of something, anger, pain, crossed his face. "Those are private." "I know," Nora said softly. "I apologize. But I had to put the house in order, and the house includes its accounts." She pushed the ledgers toward him. "You need to look at this, Mr. Crane." He didn't move. He stared at her, his jaw tight. "I pay my debts." "Yes, you do," she agreed. "You pay them, and then some. Harlan Moss has been overcharging you for 2 years. He's been compounding the interest on the land note. It's against the terms of your original agreement." She slid the contract across the table, her finger pointing to the relevant clause. "It's all here." Eli looked down. He stared at the papers as if they were snakes. For a long time he did not touch them. He just read the words she indicated, his face a mask of stone. Then, slowly, he reached out and picked up the contract. He read it from beginning to end. He opened the ledgers, his eyes moving back and forth between Sarah's neat columns and his own rough entries. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Nora could hear her own heart beating. She had crossed a line, and she did not know if he would ever forgive her for it. Finally, he looked up, and the weariness in his eyes was deeper than she had ever seen. It was the weariness of a man who had been fighting a war on too many fronts. He looked not at the papers, but at her. "He was a friend," Eli said, his voice rough. "He was Sarah's friend." "I know," Nora whispered. He pushed the ledgers away and stood up, walking to the window to look out at the darkening land. He stood there for a long time, his broad back a wall of silent contemplation. Nora stayed at the table, her hands folded in her lap. She had done what she could. The rest was up to him. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. He finally turned around. The hardness was back in his face, but it was different now. It was not the brittle hardness of grief, but the cold, sharp hardness of tempered steel. It was the look of a man who had found a new direction for his fight. "Thank you, Nora," he said. The use of her first name was a small shock. "For seeing what I could not." He did not say more. He didn't need to. In that moment, something shifted between them. The space was no longer defined by employer and employee, but by something closer to allies. A shared purpose. The confrontation came 2 days later. The morning was hot and still, the sky a vast, unforgiving blue. Nora was on the porch, shaking out a rug, when she heard the horses. 2 riders, coming up the main track. One was Harlan Moss, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. The other was a hired hand, big and impassive. Nora's stomach tightened. She had known this was coming. Moss had likely seen that his latest inflated bill was overdue and had come to apply pressure. She smoothed down her apron, her hand instinctively checking the pocket where she had placed the original contract. It was there, folded and ready. Eli came out of the barn, a piece of harness in his hand. He saw the riders and his body went still. He walked slowly toward the house, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps, positioning himself between the approaching men and his front door. "Morning, Eli," Moss said, his voice oozing a false heartiness. He swung down from his horse. "Just came by to settle up on that note. It's a bit past due." "I know what day it is, Harlan," Eli said, his voice low and even. Good, Moss said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "Then you'll know the final payment is due today. The full amount, plus the accrued interest. According to my figures, that's." Before he could finish, Nora stepped forward. She moved to the edge of the porch, her small frame looking almost fragile next to the solid timbers of the house. "Your figures are wrong, Mr. Moss." Moss's smile faltered. He looked at Nora, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He clearly dismissed her as nothing more than a hired girl. "This is business between men, Missy." "This is business about numbers," Nora corrected him, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. "And numbers are my concern. You've been compounding the interest on this note for 2 years against the written terms of the contract." She pulled the original document from her apron pocket. She did not shake it or brandish it. She simply held it. "The agreement, which you signed, specifies a 5% simple interest rate. According to my calculations, based on payments Mr. Crane has already made, he has one final payment of $68.40 remaining. Not the $400 you're claiming." Moss's face darkened. "That's ridiculous." The terms were amended. "Were they?" Nora asked, her gaze unwavering. "Then you'll have a signed copy of that amendment, I assume? Because this is the only contract Mr. Crane has. The only one his wife filed away. I doubt a woman as meticulous as Sarah Crane would have misplaced such an important document." The mention of Sarah was a deliberate, calculated blow. A hush fell over the yard. Moss's hired hand shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. This was not the simple collection he had signed on for. Eli stood at the foot of the stairs, watching. He did not look at Moss. He looked at Nora. He saw the woman who had arrived with nothing but a sewing kit, now standing on his porch, defending his land, his honor, with nothing but numbers and nerve. He saw her straight spine, her steady hands, the fierce intelligence in her eyes. And in that moment, a profound and simple truth settled over him. She had not just been mending his shirts, or fixing his porch, or balancing his books. She had been mending him. She had been stitching his broken life back together, quietly, patiently, without ever asking for a thing. She had rebuilt the foundation so he could stand again. Moss sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Now, see here, Eli. You're not going to let this woman—" Eli moved. He took the 3 steps up to the porch in a single stride and stood beside Nora. He didn't look at her, but she could feel the solid, unshakable presence of him next to her. He had taken his position. He was no longer just watching, he was with her. He looked directly at Harlan Moss, his gray eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "Harlan," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of finality. "You are speaking to my wife." The words hung in the air, more shocking than a gunshot. Nora's breath caught in her throat. Moss's jaw dropped. The hired hand stared, wide-eyed. Eli did not waver. He held Moss's gaze, his statement an unbreachable fact. "She has presented you with the final amount owed. You will take $68.40, and you will sign a receipt marking the debt paid in full. Then you will get off my land, and you will never set foot on it again." For a moment, Moss looked like he might argue. He looked from Eli's implacable face to Nora's steady gaze, and he saw a united front he could not break. He was beaten. The confidence drained out of him, leaving behind a bitter, humiliated man. Without another word, he snatched the money Eli held out, scribbled a receipt on the back of his own fraudulent bill, and swung back onto his horse. He rode away without a backward glance, his hired hand trailing behind him like a shadow. The dust settled. The sound of their hoofbeats faded into the vast Texas silence. Nora stood frozen, the contract still clutched in her hand. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She could feel the heat of Eli's arm, inches from her own. The world seemed to have shrunk to the small space they occupied on the porch. He turned to her then. The hardness had left his face, replaced by an expression she had never seen before, something open, vulnerable, and deeply earnest. "Nora," he said, his voice softer now, "I would like that to be true." She looked up at him, into his clear gray eyes, and saw her future there. She saw a lifetime of shared quiet, of steady strength, of a home rebuilt from the ashes of sorrow. "It took you long enough to get there, Eli Crane," she said, a small smile finally touching her lips. "I was hoping it would be you." He reached out and his large, calloused hand gently took hers. Her fingers curled around his, a perfect fit. The seamstress who had arrived with $2 silver and 3 days left had nothing to pack, because she had no reason left to go. She was home. Their courtship was as practical and steady as they were. There were no grand gestures, no flowery words. Love was spoken in the language they both understood. Action. It was in the way he started fixing the fences himself, his movements lighter, more purposeful than they had been in years. It was in the way she planted a small garden of vegetables by the kitchen door, a splash of green and life against the brown earth. It was in shared meals at the kitchen table, where silence slowly transformed from an empty space into a comfortable, shared peace. They talked of the weather, of the price of cattle, of the future. Real things. The wedding was a simple affair in the small church in Teller's Creek. Nora wore a dress of pale blue cotton that she had made herself, the stitches as fine and perfect as any she had ever sewn. Eli stood beside her, stolid and sure in a suit he hadn't worn in years. The whole town seemed to be there, their faces a mixture of surprise and a deep, knowing satisfaction. They had all watched the quiet woman bring the life back to the Crane Ranch, and back to its owner. They saw the rightness of it. Years passed. 5 of them, flowing by like the clear water in the spring on the land Harlan Moss had tried to steal. The ranch thrived. The house no longer sagged. It stood straight and proud, with a porch that was level and a roof that did not leak. Laughter was a common sound within its walls now, mingling with the scent of baking bread and leather. One evening, in the deep blue of a Texas twilight, Eli and Nora sat on the porch swing, the one he had repaired and strengthened the first year of their marriage. The motion was slow, rhythmic. In the yard, 2 small children played, a boy with his father's steady gray eyes and a girl with her mother's determined chin. Their shouts were a happy, chaotic music. Nora leaned her head against Eli's shoulder. She was mending one of her son's small shirts, a tear at the elbow. Her fingers, a little less nimble now, but no less skilled, moved with familiar grace. The needle rose and fell, pulling the fabric together. Eli watched her hands for a moment, then looked out at his children, at his land stretching out into the purple shadows. He felt a sense of peace so profound it was a physical presence, a warmth in his chest. "You're still mending my shirts," he said, his voice a low rumble. Nora looked up from her work, a teasing light in her eyes. "Someone has to. You are remarkably hard on your elbows, Eli Crane." He smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I remember the first stack of shirts you fixed. Left them on the table. Scared the life out of me." "Scared you?" she asked, feigning surprise. "I thought you were a man who feared nothing." "I wasn't afraid of the shirts," he clarified. "I was afraid of the hope they gave me. It had been so long I'd forgotten what it felt like." He looked at her, his gaze full of a quiet, abiding love. "You brought the hope back, Nora. You mended everything." She put down the small shirt and her sewing kit, the tools that had brought her here. She took his hand, her fingers tracing the calloused lines of his palm. Out in the yard, their daughter tripped and fell, and their son immediately ran to help her up. They came running to the porch together, their small crisis already forgotten. Nora watched them, her heart full. She had come to this place with nothing, seeking only refuge. She had found a life. She had found a quiet, steady man and helped him find his way back to himself. And in doing so, she had built a home, stitch by careful stitch.